Ecuador's election faces major challenges, including rising crime, political instability, and economic struggles. Violence linked to drug gangs threatened candidates and voters. Welcome to Riks Europe, Miguel Nunes Silva, Director of Trezeno Institute and local councilman in Portugal.
Thank you, Rebecca, once again.
So can you tell us what are the biggest concerns for the Ecuadorians in this election?
Well, the economy in Latin America, of course, is always a big issue. Predictably, there's always two competing formulas that electors have to choose from. In Latin America, they would call it the neoliberal one, or a more pro-free market one on the right, and then a more socialist, state-based one on the left. Ecuador is, of course, an impoverished country, so the economy is always a pressing issue. But nowadays, a big topic has been crime. Ecuador has seen extreme levels of violence, urban violence, happening. This is, I would say, a similar process to what you saw, for example, in Venezuela. If you remember, when Chavez took over in Venezuela, basically there were large nationalizations, and one of the ways that the government had to capitalize on or try to appeal to votes was not only to enact these very generous welfare programs in very poor neighborhoods, but also in recruiting poor people and people from impoverished areas to work for the government in some capacity. And the result of that was that the destruction of the economy, destruction of the free market economy, led to urban gangs that had more or less some connection to the government. Now, in Ecuador, that didn't happen directly, also because Ecuador did not have the oil wealth that had Venezuela. But the problem is that once these governments become a bit more authoritarian or dictatorial, there's a certain degree of tolerance that is developed towards drug-related activities. So if you are in Latin America, a right-wing party is very close to the big business multinational companies, which can lead to corruption with government and public contracts. But the one advantage that they have is that they don't necessarily need the drug trade to make money. But if you come from the left, so you come from impoverished areas and you take control of government, either you are elected or you have a dictatorship, you don't have these business connections, especially as in the case of Ecuador under Rafael Correa, where the connections to Washington and the United States were severed. So the Correa government a few years ago was very close to Chavez, very close to Venezuela. There was an organization called ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, that was supposed to rival the free market arrangements that the United States had created. And so because you were far away from European investors and American investors, and you depended a lot on Venezuelan money, the only other source of revenue for a lot of low-level politicians had to be corruption. And in the case of Ecuador being on the trade routes, a lot of it was connected with drug trade. Now, the problem, of course, with the drug trade is that because it's illegal and because it brings faction infighting and cartel rivalries, it sparks a lot of violence. Now, whereas in countries like, say, Colombia or Peru, you actually have production of drugs, of basically the cartels trying to export them to the United States, but they produce them in Latin America, they produce them also in Mexico now. In Ecuador, it's not so much the production that is the problem, it's a smaller country. But they are on the route. They are on the route from Peru and also to a certain extent Colombia, from the Pacific all the way to the United States. And this creates immense instability. And the structural problem, I would say, that Ecuador has is that because it's a small country, it cannot actually influence these policies and these flows. If you are Colombia, you can try to tackle corruption or tackle drug trade. But Ecuador is dependent on markets, production markets and consumption markets that are not its own. So if the violence increases in Peru and Colombia, there isn't really that much that Ecuador can do. Now, after the fall of the Correa government, the leftist, socialist, Marxist government of Rafael Correa, there was an intermediate period where there was uncertainty, ideological uncertainty. And then they finally had a more center-right, they would call neoliberal government. And that government changed policies completely. And one of the one of the policies that one of the causes that advanced those politicians from the right was to tackle crime, to put crime under control. Now, the current president, Noboa, has been a president for a couple of years. He tried to decrease crime, to fight crime. He succeeded to an extent. There was a decrease in crime rates, but not to the extent that it would be, let's say, a miracle, as happened in El Salvador with the forces there, the parties there. In Ecuador, it's very, very relative, it's marginal. And that is the reason why the results of this first election were so close. So both parties had around 44%. So the key to the second round of the presidential elections is going to be, it seems, where the indigenous people are going to vote. Now, the right-wing government had pretty good results in indigenous dominated provinces, let's put it that way, which is surprising because the indigenous community in Ecuador had been political allies of the leftist Rafael Correa government in the past. One of the reasons could be that they are also scared by the crime rates, and so they want a government to tackle crime. Another reason could be that because they live in more mountainous areas and in more rural areas, they are also more socially conservative. Now, one of the problems is that the rival of Noboa, President Noboa, is a former parliamentarian called González. And this woman was sort of a candidate that was found at the last minute. But the problem is that she comes from the littoral, the coastal urban areas of Ecuador. And she is very influential in urban elites and in university electorates, highly educated, highly qualified, but not so much in the rural areas. So the election was very, very close, and the second round is predicted to be equally as close in its results.
How significant will this election be in April for people? Will there be change, do you believe?
Well,
improvements, perhaps.
At this moment in Latin America, it's an interesting moment because for many years, governments were either center-right or outright leftists, or completely almost Marxist. And now for the first time, with the election of Milei in Argentina, with Bukele in El Salvador, there is a rising, no longer center-right, centrist left, but a strong conservative right-wing ideology and movement that is rising in Latin America as well. And Ecuador had been, until now, one of the few right-wing governments in power in South America. So there's basically Paraguay, there's Argentina, and that was pretty much it. Ecuador was the third one. If Ecuador falls back to the left, then, well, the results are going to be welcomed by countries like Brazil, certainly Venezuela, and even Colombia. If it remains a right-wing government, then it's very interesting because we don't know exactly yet what the right-wing governments of Latin America will be able to do together. There is will, I think, to cooperate, but because there are too few of them at the moment, the potential isn't quite there yet. And for Ecuadorians, it remains to be seen whether, even though it's a right-wing government, even though it has good connections with Washington, whether that would be enough to fight crime effectively.
And of course, you've mentioned many of the challenges here, but what will be the main challenges that the next elected president would face after winning?
I mean, certainly the crime issue is the big one in these elections. In terms of the economy, if there was a right-wing government in power, it would be interesting to see whether they would be able to establish any sort of commercial agreements with the United States. Now, Trump is a negotiator, as you know. He might be willing to give friendly right-wing governments in South America more of a boost, especially to counter, to give an alternative to Venezuelan and Cuban influence. So probably a right-wing government in Ecuador would be far better suited to strike deals with Trump than a left-wing one.
Thank you very much, Miguel Nunes Silva, Director of Trezeno Institute and local councilman in Portugal, for your insights.
Thank you once again, Ruby.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.